Welcome to Know What I Mean. My name's Oscar.
My name's George, and in this episode, we talk about avoiding responsibility to find peace, becoming at ease with the turbulence of life, and my secret obsession. Let's get into the episode.
It's a bit like a broken record, this now, because this quote turns out to not be by Virginia Woolf.
No way.
And you know what's extra annoying about that is that I actually got this quote from a quote book.
No way.
So I really assumed that they would have done their research.
Since we first started, I think there must have been at least four quotes now that have been the first person they were attributed to was wrong.
Yeah. I like this quote. And again, as we mentioned before, it doesn't really take away from it. It's still a good quote. So the quote for this week is, "You cannot find peace by avoiding life." And it was attributed to Virginia Woolf, but it is not by her. Obviously, life in the case of this quote is not just all of life. It's stuff like messiness, grit, difficulty, friction we might experience in our lives. It's where life isn't clean and all perfect. It's when it's a bit more messy. And also peace. There's two ways you can think about peace, I guess. One is an outward peace. That would be the opposite of war, where external conditions are at rest, at peace. But I actually think that what this quote's referring to is more of an inner peace that isn't tied up with external conditions. You can't find inner peace by avoiding the grit and friction and difficulty of life. And you can find peace by embracing this difficulty, by really allowing it in and allowing it to transform you.
I thought of it as well as like peace is kind of the acceptance. So accepting life and accepting the grit, like how people often say, oh, life just got in the way. It's accepting those emergent, perhaps negative things that can happen and accepting them rather than avoiding life, which is a rejection of what is and what is happening. And I think that is a very valuable process to go through rather than rejecting your experience of what's happening, accepting it and going into it. But it can be quite a tricky process to do. And there's some times where life does just get too much. It can feel like it gets too complex or too confusing or too hard, and you just don't want to engage with it anymore. You want to kind of retreat into something else. And avoidance is kind of like a poor man's peace. It's kind of a knockoff, cheap substitute for actual peace. Because when you're avoiding something, you're rejecting what's happening and you're creating a situation that you can accept, something that can make you feel peaceful. But while you're in this realm that you've kind of created of peace, the longer you remain in that place, then it builds a tension between the two. The further you avoid the life, the more tension is built up in that rubber band, and the more force it's going to spring back with once you're finally confronted with life. Because the avoidance of it can only be temporary. It can only be a temporary escape from something that you don't feel like you can deal with.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I think it's really interesting to notice the difference between genuine peace, genuinely feeling at rest, the difference between that and just pushing things down or choosing to not actually face something. Because the experience is so different. There's a wholeness, a completeness, or a real depth to peace and then feeling at ease, and it is very deep. It's really interesting whenever I go into a space, I don't know, you can't really use words correctly in regards to peace, I don't think, somehow. But whenever I feel very peaceful, every time it throws me off guard at how still and deep that experience is in comparison to me, the poor man's peace, trying to avoid my problems. Say, for example, with drinking, I'd have a beer to settle after the day, and it's definitely a lot more like just throwing a sheet. Like, for listeners, I've got like loads of boxes from Just Moved House in my background, and I guess it would be a bit like just throwing a sheet over those boxes to cover them up. It kind of, when we look at them, we might not see the intricacy and detail of them, and somehow it feels slightly better to not have them on show, but it's all there and it's all got to be dealt with at some point. And I guess me compulsively checking my phone or drinking a beer or whatever is similar. It's just covering something really temporarily, and it does nothing to actually deal with the issue.
One of the strategies that I have used for avoiding life in my past, I don't know, can you guess what I'm going to say?
Greg sausage rolls? No.
No, although I'm a glutton for those. No, it's when I used to play RuneScape a lot when I was when I was younger, and I was at a festival when I was about to turn 18, and it was like the longest time in ages that I hadn't played RuneScape, which is kind of like a online, kind of like a World of Warcraft game. You train your levels and make money and do all these different things. And when I was at this festival, this was like the first time in a very long time where I'd gone more than a day without playing. And I remember I had such a great time at this festival, and just deciding that was it. I wanted to finish with it and just enjoy my life and have more experiences like this, rather than kind of hiding away from it and just playing RuneScape. So I didn't play for ages. But then in my final year of university, when I was feeling really overwhelmed with all the projects I had to do and just really kind of feeling quite unhappy and just kind of confused and overwhelmed with all the things that there were to do, I remember RuneScape just kind of popping up into my head and being like, oh, I wonder what's going on with that game. Like, is it still about? Like, what's up with it? And kind of searching it on YouTube and looking at some videos, and then like next thing you know, 5 minutes later, I'm like re-downloading the game and logging in. And at this time, I had this program which tracks all of the apps that I use on my computer throughout the week. So each week it would send me a thing of like, oh, you've spent this much time on Photoshop, this much time on Google Chrome or whatever it was. And at the end of the week, I got an email from them informing me that I played RuneScape for 90 hours that week. And it kind of just gone. Like, there was all this resistance. Everything was kind of felt confusing in my life. I wasn't quite sure where I was going or what I should be working on. And it just was so easy for me to replace those problems with the problems in the game. And with the game, it's just so simple. You're like, okay, I need to get up my archery level or my magic level or all these different skills that you have. You just go to the place, you train it, you progress, you get experience points. And it's a very linear form of progression and very simple. You can't go back. You can't really make the wrong choice and then lose experience. It's just a simple, easy version of life, really, which is kind of what makes it so addictive.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing with that is, I found when I came back to my life, I'd kind of just traded my problems for a week for these much more simple, easy to deal with problems. But after coming back, I was in the same place, but with just less time left to do my projects.
What's so funny about that story is, because you get a lot of people's stories which are just like, yeah, I was just eating takeaways and just doing shit all and just playing video games throughout uni. And you weren't like that. Like, I knew you then, and you had your head screwed on. And it's so inconceivable to me that you would literally just play 90 hours of RuneScape when you told me that initially, it was just so funny because I just could not imagine that from you.
Yeah.
You're waking up multiple days and making the decision to carry on playing. I find that odd from you, and also it is hilarious as well because there were so many opportunities to make an alternative decision, and still you just chose to do it anyway.
Yeah.
This reminds me of, so I was chatting to my friend Tom, I think this was about a week ago, and I was actually reflecting on why do I choose to take on responsibility. It was just an inquiry as opposed to like I have no idea why I do it. But I help to run young Buddhist events, do this podcast. I do a lot of my own artwork and things like that, which basically means that most evenings and like my weekend days, for example, are spent making and actually doing things when I needn't do that. Essentially, I could have a lot more peaceful life, in quotations, by not taking on those responsibilities, because it means that I have expectations of myself, but also you're showing up here. You have an expectation that I'm going to be showing up. If I'm doing stuff at the Young Buddhist things, I'm literally helping to run sessions or running sessions where there's 20 people there and they're expecting something worthwhile. And it can be stressful. It can be a bit of a pain to do that week in, week out. And I was just thinking like, it's bizarre that I'm choosing to put myself in a position where I'm being held accountable, basically, when it would be potentially more peaceful or easier to just not, and to just watch TV and to just chill. And Tom replied essentially that people who don't choose to take on responsibility and choose to do not much in the hope of a more safe and peaceful existence, they will also experience higher levels of stress, but in simpler situations. Because I've done public speaking, for example, that means at work when I have to present an idea, compared to actually leading sessions and doing things, it doesn't really feel like a big deal. If you don't choose to put yourself in situations that people are expecting things of you very often, then many, many small things, supposedly small things, can essentially, it's all relative. Those smaller things become bigger based on the fact that you're not doing them. So my initial thoughts about what me and Tom were talking about was that there are a lot of benefits of putting yourself in positions where you're responsible for things because you gain a lot of things. But people who don't do that, the only thing that they're losing is they're not actually being creative in the way that they might want to. But they basically live a pretty calm, peaceful existence. And essentially what Tom was saying was that actually that's not necessarily the case. You've decided to play it quite safe by not doing things, but that just ends up magnifying potentially much smaller everyday friction that actually happens ordinarily in life anyway. So what might have been avoidance of playing it safe actually doesn't lead to feeling peaceful anyway.
Yeah. What that says is that you can't actually avoid life. And it's more the attempt to avoid it, which is inevitably unsuccessful. Like that's the kind of suffering is trying to avoid life when you're alive. It's an oxymoron. You can't avoid life while you're alive. It's going to still be there. You can kind of do things to try and numb it and escape it, but it's still there. There's a concept of hedonic adaptation, which is that people generally have a set level of how cheerful of a person they are, and that actually changes a very small amount based on your environment. Now, it can have quick, jumps and changes when you have big lifestyle changes, but they're not very consistent. The age-old example of someone winning the lottery, they get elated as it happens, and then perhaps a year or so later, they're either the same amount of happy or perhaps less happy than they were a year before. Also, a similar thing can happen if someone has an accident. People who are kind of become amputees, for example, they're not necessarily less happy people after the initial part of getting used to the accident they've had or whatever it is. Very often, this is the case that people who have a big increase in what you'd see as their quality of life don't have a huge increase in their happiness, not consistently. And the same with people who have a big downgrade. So it mirrors what you're saying, that the people who try and avoid all these responsibilities are going to have the same amount of stress as someone who accepts a load of responsibilities. It seems life has got a weird way of being quite similar based on who you are, your character, and your most common states of consciousness, and how those are less tightly correlated with your external environment than people often believe.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that drew me to RuneScape when I was playing was that it's a linear progression. You don't slide back, or you don't go down the wrong path. You're always moving ahead. You can't like build up skills in something that in a job career that becomes obsolete, or any things like that. They just don't really happen within the game in the same way. But life is much more of a wiggly line of ups and downs. And when you're in the downs and when things are tricky and you're experiencing the harder sides of life, when you're experiencing that, of course, you would much prefer to at least be in the middle, in a kind of more linear, less exciting, but less painful experience. So whenever you're at the bottom, you're going to want to be like, well, at least if I can get to the middle. And that's often what that avoidance is like just getting you to a kind of neutral state, at least, which is not as bad as the suffering that you're experiencing. But obviously that is going to nerf the peaks as well.
Yeah.
The same way I've never taken antidepressants, but I've heard people talk about them and how often they can kind of just mute everything. Like they narrow the troughs and the peaks of your life, so that everything is just a more neutral, grey, boring sort of line in between, without as profound sadness or as elated excitement.
Yeah, I've had the experience recently, and it's a disappointing experience of if I get really excited about something, but in quite a almost adrenaline-y way. Like I've had my morning coffee, I'm just getting stuck into a project and I'm getting really excited about it. There will be a point in the day when I crash, which sucks. I don't want to crash, but it's like I'll go up on this kind of thing, and I'm committing to the roller coaster. You know, I'm committing to going up, and what goes up must come down. And it was a really disappointing kind of thing to recognize recently. And I think it's something that I've been a bit in denial about, but I always do have these crashes when I kind of decide to go to that kind of height, which is quite funny. I think to link it back to the quote, you can't find peace by avoiding life, in regards to this roller coaster and choosing a life that embraces the ups and downs, is more of a sense of being at peace, as opposed to the experience of a consistent peace, feeling still, but maybe feeling more at peace with the ups and downs, and the having more of a perspective on this kind of change. And I think that's definitely been my experience of growing up, has been seeing these cycles of ups and downs and becoming more at peace with the downs of them, because it's quite easy to be at peace with the high points, but being more at ease with, I feel lower today and this too shall pass. This isn't consistently how it's going to be. And I may even paint a picture that is the case, but that is literally just because of the state I'm in, that I'm perceiving everything in that way. But by embracing these cycles of ups and downs, just feeling more content that life is like that. And I'm totally expecting to listen to this back in 10 years and be like, you know nothing, Jon Snow kind of thing. Like, this is one of those insights, I think, that just gets deeper and deeper as you get older, because you've seen these cycles more and more times, and you become more and more at ease, hopefully, with yourself and your particular ways of dealing with life and your particular suffering. because we all have our own particular suffering.
Yeah.
And that peace, being at peace with those cycles, gets deeper.
And whereas if you're constantly just trying to avoid these cycles, I think that is what can make it, like we said, the ups and the downs, regardless of whether you try and avoid life or be at peace with it, they're still going to happen. However, if you're avoiding them, you're not going to learn through them the same way that you are when you're trying to be at peace with them. Whenever you're in that down period, like I did, just go to playing RuneScape or whatever, you can get better at understanding those patterns and resisting that, and realizing that that's kind of a fool's gold, something that's may seem attractive in the moment, but you've gone down that path enough times where you realize it's just not the right thing to do.
Yeah, it doesn't work, essentially. It doesn't actually, it doesn't give what is promising.
No.
It's not going to solve anything. It's not going to, it will only really temporarily relieve things and quite often exacerbate them. If I drink my way out of feeling bad, which isn't a habit of mine, but being hungover sucks. And I suffer the whole next day for like a few hours of relief from that suffering. So often it actually exacerbates the problem as well. A few weeks ago, so it's pretty recent, I had a work deadline. Essentially, we were sending a load of books to be printed. And so there's a certain pressure with that kind of work where you're having to check things really thoroughly. You know that potentially thousands of books are going to get messed up if you're not thorough enough with your checks. So this was the first time that me and my colleague had actually been set this task. So we didn't really know what we were doing, and we had a week to do it in. It became very apparent that we didn't give ourselves enough time, and I started to really feel the pressure of having to complete this task, not having enough time, not feeling quite incompetent and not really knowing what I was doing, and having to muddle along and work it out, but also knowing that the consequence of me doing that and making a mistake was quite high. And I don't have a tendency of feeling very anxious. Like, I do get anxious, but I wouldn't say that I suffer from anxiety. It's not a thing that is really prominent in my life. But on this day, I really started to feel quite a strong sense of anxiety. So my heart rate was high. I felt irritable. I felt quite afraid. I started to get that feeling of something's pushing up from your chest a bit. You're really starting to feel like everything's tightening up, and it really was quite unpleasant. And as the day went on, I was quite alarmed because I don't generally experience this very much, but I assumed when I finish the day, even though I've still got to do this work tomorrow, I'll be able to put this down because I do have an ability to do that in general. But as I got to the end of the day, basically the momentum of the anxiety just carried through to after work. And I wanted to sit with my parents to hang out for a bit, but I had to basically excuse myself because I was just feeling too overwhelmed. So I went to my room and tried the usual tactics of distracting myself, going on my phone, watching stuff, just waiting for it to blow over, but it wasn't. And as I switched the light off to go to sleep, I still felt very constricted and unable to sleep. And then having that thing of how many hours have I got left to sleep? And this is going to make tomorrow worse, and da-da-da. At a certain point, it became clear that I had to act on what was going on. I tried all the different tactics of just hoping it would disappear, distracting myself. And at a certain point, I decided to try turning towards it because it didn't really feel like there was any other option. And I was just there lying awake anyway, so there was nothing else to do. So the process was that I just went into my body and just started to fully experience what was happening. And I still felt very uneasy, but something about me going into my body and just really embracing what was going on there started to have an alchemical transformative effect. And I'd love to say that this was just a moment where something changed, but actually I was lying there for like an hour and just slowly saying yes to what was going on in my body and my experience. And at a certain point, I did just experience peace. it didn't mean that the sensation of that momentum from the day totally went away, but I just embraced it and said okay to what was happening, which completely changed what was happening. So it was almost like the frame that all of this is, the space or the frame that all of this uncomfortable experience was happening in, was transformed, and I was able to hold this difficult experience in a different way. And I think this story for me really connects with this quote, because it was one of those experiences of doing all the things to try and get rid of and change and avoid what was going on. And it was only until I actually embraced it that something shifted. Another experience I had from this was just, and I remember telling you about this on the day that it happened, actually, that just a huge amount of gratitude for having this practice of investigation, and knowing that even in this very difficult experience, I could turn to that, and just feeling like a massive amount of gratitude, because that's not a given, you know, that's something that's been trained over a long time. And even so, it wasn't the first thing I turned to, but just feeling like massively grateful for having that as a tool. Before George reads next week's quote, thank you so much for listening. If you fancy subscribing, that would be fantastic. Also, if you can think of anyone that would enjoy this week's episode, then please just give it a share, send it over to them. If you fancied supporting the podcast financially, you could buy us a coffee. That would be fantastic. So the link is in the description for this episode, wherever you're listening or watching.
The quote I've chosen for next week is from Scott Adams. There's no such thing as a small act of kindness. Every act creates a ripple with no logical end.
That is really nice.
I'm excited for that. It's a nice trippy quote. If you guys got any thoughts about the quote, then you can shoot us a message on Instagram, which is knowwhatimean.podcast. And we've got a link to our email as well in the description if you want to message us on there and tell us your thoughts about the quote and any things that you think we should include in the episode. Thanks for listening. Enjoy the rest of your week, and we'll see you in the next episode. Peace.